My name's Marjorie Sussman, and I am a trust and estates lawyer here. And I've been here for about 11 years, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. And one of the things that kind of is a constant theme of doing this kind of practice is that we start out with our clients, and we have a very personal conversation at the beginning about their family history and their health and how their children get along and what their goals are for themselves and for their kids and for their grandchildren. And I try to draft their documents so that what they want to have happen on a legal basis will happen. But when they look at their documents, the clients often say, like, this is nothing about me. This doesn't reflect me at all. And I can't fix that, because what I do has to work on a different level. And so I encourage people to take that responsibility on for themselves, to talk about their health, to talk about their goals for their families, and to talk about their personal histories. But it's a hard thing to do. So that's kind of the genesis of this series of programs that we're doing, is how to bridge the gap between our dry legal documents and what's going to happen on the ground. So the first program, we talked about health care. We had a terrific speaker, Diane Savastano, who may show up. At least her name tag's here.
She's on the table.
Okay. And she talked about sort of bridging the gap between the healthcare proxy, which doesn't really say much, and how to actually get the end-of-life care that you are hoping for. In our second program, we had Doug Baumel and Blair Tripp from Continuity, and they talked about the transition between your business succession documents and what will actually happen on the ground when the next generation takes over a business, or it's applicable also to vacation properties, and was basically focused on financial assets. And this program is, well, what we're hoping is to give people tools on how to actually express their personal legacies, their values, and what they want for their families, or telling their grandchildren about the source of the wealth or the history of the family business. And so we've got two great speakers. David O'Neill is a principal of a company called Story Trust, and he bills himself as a personal historian. And Susan Turnbull, who's the principal of Personal Legacy Advisors. And I've been aware of Susan's work for a long time, because she's really been at the forefront of a movement to have people do what we call ethical wills. So ethical wills aren't really wills. I don't know why they're called that, but they are an expression of people's values. Their bios are in your materials, and I'm going to turn the program over to them.
Thanks, Marjorie, and thanks to the staff at Davis Malm for having us this morning. What I'd like to do is to start by giving you a little bit of a quiz, just to test your knowledge. And so that quiz is located on the inside front cover of this blue booklet of the wish flower. I call them dandelions, but a friend of mine called them wish flowers, which I think is a much nicer way to describe them. And so inside, there are a series of questions which I'll go through with you. And what this is designed to do is to see the need for documenting and recording family histories. Because, what do you know about your family? So here are the questions. And as you can see, these are just yes or no questions. So you can kind of answer them to yourselves. Do you know the story of how your grandparents met? Do you know your family's immigration story? Do you know what your father's first job was? Do you know who your mother's best friend was from childhood? Do you know how to create or recreate your grandmother's favorite recipes? And do you know the source of your own name? And do you know the names of the schools that your parents attended? Was anybody in the room able to answer yes to every single one of these? So it would be accurate to say that most of us really couldn't answer kind of yes to maybe even most of these questions. Did some of them actually trigger a memory or a story that comes to mind that of a story that you had heard when you were a child, or one that you still remember? And would anyone be interested in sharing briefly what that story was, what the memory was? Doug?
So my grandmother used to make these great chocolate cakes for us. And for decades, we were trying to, well, we're still trying to figure out the recipe. The problem was she was this really elderly, I only know her as elderly Jewish woman. And when we asked her to write down the recipe, and it was a pinch of salt, some flour, and so that's like the family joke, in our family about recipes, because we could never recreate it. It was always a pinch of this, some flour. That's not a pinch, this is a pinch. It was very funny. Anyway, so the recipes was a good trigger.
And did you have an opportunity to then find the way to convert it to measurements and so that it can be replicated?
No. We still try. We never made it exactly the same way. So no, it's a recipe lost to the gone with the wind.
Lost to history. Yeah, it's.
But the story remains.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Marjorie?
So my mother had a fabulous cheesecake recipe, and it was a family secret. And when I asked for it, she said, "It's a family secret." And I said, "I'm in the family." And she said, "But you'll tell all your friends." And she wouldn't give it to me. And so it's also lost forever.
To this day, it's gone. It's gone. Right. Glenn?
Well, my mom passed away a couple of years ago when we were going through her condo in Florida. And, there were a lot of emotional findings along there, but one of the things we found was a book, a three-ring binder with my grandmother's recipes all written out in her handwriting. So we just gave that to my daughter for her wedding.
Oh, wow.
So the thing that moved me about it was not the recipes, but seeing her handwriting, because that's what brought back my grandmother, because she had the best penmanship. That doesn't exist today, penmanship, and my grandmother had it. So.
That's a great story. Thank you. And I have at the end, I'll have a project idea about how to share those recipes with kind of a broader audience in the family. So, just getting the sense of just sharing these stories, we have these stories passed on, but there's also this part that's missing of all of our family heritage, the stories that have been passed on. There's something that's always missing. But we yearn to know. We have this yearning desire to know the recipe or to know the story. And there's this problem where the stories don't get passed on for one reason or another. And my goal is to share with you some ways and approaches that families can jumpstart this process and facilitate this process. I had a very personal experience just this last week with my niece, who's a freshman in college. And she sent me this text. This is the text itself. She says, "Hi, Dave. I can't get her to call me Uncle Dave. I don't know why. I keep trying, but they don't call me Uncle Dave. Do you know where we originate from in Ireland?" In parentheses, "like O'Neill's, question mark." I'm like, where did this come from? So I wrote to her. I said, "Timothy O'Neill was born in Valencia, County Kerry in Ireland, and we used to spell it with two L's. My great-grandfather's chopped off the second L, so we spell it with one. I have more info on him somewhere. Why so curious? Just wondering, exclamation point. It interests me, thanks, smiley face emoticon," right? So and so when my response back was, "When you visit, I know she's coming at Christmas, I'll show you the family tree and the photos I have. Yay, awesome, thanks." Right? So, this is such a quintessential 21st century, teenager interaction with her 50-year-old, uncle. But what it highlights is this yearning to know. But the thing that also Erin knows is that all of her grandparents have passed away. They're all gone. So when my parents and her grandparents had the opportunity to share their stories, none of us were cognizant of the fact that maybe we should take some time and record this so that we're going to answer these questions that the grandkids are going to have, not now, because they're not aware. They haven't developed the maturity or the sense of perspective to even ask the questions. So this is the essential problem, is by the time we become old enough to want to know, the people who do know are gone. So it's on us, the adult children, to take on the responsibility of making sure that those family elders tell their stories. So even though we want to know, we wait too long. And this is even my story, that I waited too long. And that's what got me started helping families record stories, is because I missed the opportunity to record my parents' stories. And because I just thought they'd be around forever, nothing was going to become of them, or nothing bad would happen. They both died separately, suddenly, no stories. But what I did was I recorded other family stories. And I want to share one with you. It's the first recording I ever did with my Uncle Joe, who was 90 at the time. And I asked him the simplest question in the world, which is, what is the origin of your name? So here's what he said. What is your full name?
Joseph Smith O'Neill.
And do you know where that name came from?
Yeah. The first name came from my father. His name was Joseph James O'Neill.
And what about the Smith part?
All right, the Smith part came. There used to be a old man. His name was Smith. I don't even know what his first name is now. He had money. And he told my mother that if she called me Smith, he would leave her something in his will. So I got my name like that, but he sure as heck didn't leave anything.
My Uncle Joe's since passed away, and it's hard for me not to get emotional every time I listen to that. I was sharing with Joanne that Longfellow has this saying that the voice is the organ of the soul, that when we're able to capture a person's voice and record it, and especially have it after they're gone, it conveys, you got something about my Uncle Joe just by listening to him, and you don't know him at all. And it evokes a lot of emotion, a lot of memory for me, to listen to him now. And so if we just take that opportunity to record the stories with the family elders that we have, Thanksgiving is coming up. It's a perfect opportunity to record family stories. However, not after the meal when everyone's a little kind of loosened up, and not in a table situation where you can't hear what anybody's saying. There are some guidelines that I could suggest of best ways to record someone's story. And we say that family legacies are important. It's a virtue that we give lip service to. And there was a study that was done by the Allianz Life Insurance Company. And the question was, which ranks highest in importance? Family stories, personal possessions, or financial inheritance? So the top and the blue line are the boomers, and the green line, the green icons, are the family elders. A high percentage thought family stories was a much higher importance than the inheritance itself. Now, I'm not sure how valid the data are based on behavior, but people do express a desire to record the family stories, but they just don't have the mechanism to do that. So, and most parents would like to tell their children how they would like to be remembered, but they realize they've never been asked. And the thing that I've learned in the 8 years that I've been doing personal histories is that the younger generation needs to ask the older generation. Even if you might have somebody who's a great storyteller, they have a wonderful ego that won't be bruised by anything, by telling their story and sharing it and having a recording, they're kind of putting themselves out there to be listened to and possibly judged. So they want to know that their stories will be well received. And so if you ask for them, they'll be more apt to share them. In the same study, children would like to ask, but they don't know how. So one of the purposes of this guide that I put together is to actually facilitate that conversation, to share it with family members. And I'll go through this a little bit with you in the next few minutes. The end result of this desire but lack of action is something called the legacy gap, is that by the time you realize that you'd like to record these stories, it's too late because of procrastination, because of not only avoiding the medical conversation, but just avoiding any conversation about, we want to record your stories. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, we know you're not going to be here forever, so we want to, while you're healthy and while things are going well, let's record them now. And then in 5 years, we'll do it again, record more stories. So you don't want to give, of course, the impression to the family elder that this is the swan song, this is the end, right? This is the unspoken objection that people have. You're asking me this because I've got one foot in the grave? Is this why you want me to do this? And so you want to, minimize that. And for family businesses, recording those stories turns this intangible asset, their history, their stories, their lessons, the struggles that they had, into a tangible asset, but that asset is at risk unless it's recorded. Jay Hughes, who was an attorney and a writer and a consultant to a lot of family offices and family enterprises, talks about family wealth in a way that's different than just the assets. He says that a family's wealth consists of many assets. It's human capital, it's intellectual capital, it's spiritual capital, it's social capital. And it's greater than just the dollars and cents. And so it's really important for families and family businesses to recognize that. I was interviewing a 90-year-old patriarch of a fourth-generation family business, and this is what he told me. He said, "Unless I tell the story, the early history of the business will be lost forever, or even worse, misrepresented or misunderstood." So one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill is, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." So if you leave the story to someone else, they might get it wrong, they might misinterpret it, they might not spin it in the way that you would have put it together. So it's an opportunity for the family, the founders of the business, or the family elders, to really put their mark on their legacy by actually being explicit and articulating that. And Jay Hughes has this quote about that every family he knows that is successful in preserving its wealth for multiple generations, and he talks about 7-generation wealth, sets aside time at family gatherings for sharing its unique history. So it's built in to the family culture when they have family assembly meetings or other kinds of family group meetings to share those stories. So in the few minutes I have left, I just want to run through some of the ideas and some of the projects that families can engage in to record these stories. It doesn't have to be a full-length memoir or a documentary video. It can be other kinds of things. I think that's the main work that I do, is help families produce a memoir or a complete oral history. But often it's taking steps prior to that gets them ready to tell their stories. One is to just record the family records. So if in this booklet, starting on page 12, you will see that I've put together some forms that just help you document your own life history. It's amazing how many, after someone dies, all that genealogical material that's in their heads is gone, and so then you have to rely on Ancestry.com or searching through records, and the only thing you actually get are the data points, the birth date, the death date, and that's it. You don't get any story. So while a person has the opportunity just to document who their parents were, where they were from, any information that they have, this will help prime the pump for any future family genealogists who want to record the stories. So that's a very simple task. Starting on page 21, you will see that there's a personal timeline. So whenever I interview someone to record their stories and document their history, I always ask them to put together a personal timeline. because it helps put their life in perspective. Because people will remember events not by the date, but by relative dates. Oh, that was 2 years before my grandfather passed away. And so when I'm recording stories, I'm standing in place of the second or third generation down who won't know that perspective. They need to know the date of when things happened. So I try to encourage people to think just in terms of dates. And also there's a concept that triggers in, it's called memories beget memories, is that once you start thinking systematically about your life, and you start thinking about what happened when you were in high school, what did you do, what was your first job, was it when you were in high school, or when you were junior high, or was it a paper route, those trigger other memories that can then be incorporated and recorded. So it's really a great way to spark the process. So that's the simplest way, is to use this booklet. And for those of you who are advisors, and you can, I have copies of this that I can share with you, that you can just give to your clients and to say, here's a document that can help you kind of fill in those gaps that these nicely crafted trust documents or the financial plan just don't have room for. Susan is going to talk about ethical wills, also called legacy letters. So I'll leave it to her to kind of give a little bit more explanation about that. But that's another tool that can be used. People can write their own memoirs. There are lots of memoir writing classes that help facilitate that, essay writing classes that can facilitate that. But people can also do an as-told-to memoir. And that's, again, the work that I do, is by interviewing someone, recording their story, I can help them put together a memoir. I'm the ghostwriter, but it's their story. So here are two examples. Vittorio Palumbo lived, his family, he's from Italy, and his family entered a lottery to colonize Libya in the 1930s. And so he went to Libya when he was a young child, sent back to the indoctrination schools that Mussolini had set up before the war, and was separated from his parents for 9 years during the Second World War. Quite a saga. And then this is a kind of a family history and a business history of the family that owns Cumberland Farms. Quite a fascinating story of starting with one cow that produced a lot of milk. They sold the milk. They bought a truck. They delivered the milk. They started a milk store. Those of us who are old enough to remember milk stores, not convenience stores, where they just primarily sold milk. And so they have a record of the origins of this really successful and thriving family business. Documentary videos are a great way to capture the person's voice and their mannerisms. I've done this for businesses too, but I'm just mindful of the time. So I'm just going to skip down to a couple other ideas and just share with you two other story examples. An oral history, recording the person's story, just their voice, which is often a lot less intimidating than having a camera and lights recording them. One project I did for a client was an oral history project for PNC Bank. And I'm just going to share it with you with one of the people I interviewed, and ultimately you'll understand who he is and what the story's about.
One day I was building a golf course out in Palm Springs, and it was like 116 degrees. And I said to the waitress, "Would you bring me a glass of tea and a glass of lemonade?" And she did, and I poured a quarter of the tea out of it, and I poured about a quarter of the lemonade in it. And another girl in the restaurant heard me do that. And when the waitress went to take her orders, she said, "Waitress, I want a Palmer." She said, "What did you say?" "I want a Palmer, that drink that you mixed Arnold Palmer over there." and they started ordering Palmers.
Wow.
So I had the privilege of going to Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and interviewing Arnold Palmer for this project that PNC had put together. And it was the last question I asked him. I said, "So by the way, what is the story behind the drink?" And I've searched the internet. There's no other story that exists of him telling the story exactly that way. And what did you notice about, at least the recipe, that everybody has missed?
Yeah.
3/4 tea, 1/4 lemonade is an Arnold Palmer. It's not half and half, which is kind of what most people think. Another opportunity is to take the family heirlooms and tell the story behind them and document them by taking a photograph of it and recording that story somehow. I can't tell you how many times families have heirlooms and they don't know the origin of the item, where it came from, what it means. Recipes. Glenn, here's the idea: is what you can do is you can scan the recipe card and keep your grandmother's handwriting, and then just type out the recipe too, which might be easier to follow, and then that you can share that with anybody in the family, and that's a great idea for sharing family recipes. I do want to end my portion of the presentation before I hand it over to Susan with one last recording of a woman, Nadia, and I interviewed her when she was 98 years old, and she had a great-grandchild, Sean, who was a baby. And she knew that he would not know her. She passed away 3 years later at 101. And she wanted to make sure that her stories, which were extraordinary, she was born in 1910, lived through the Russian Revolution of 1917, exiled to Turkey, lived in Palestine before World War II, lived in the same rent-control apartment for 67 years in New York City. Amazing, amazing life. And here's what she said about her reasons for wanting to record her stories.
Of course, Holly and Lauren will remember, they know me. One is now 23, and also they grew up with me. So they'll remember, and they'll know that I love them. But little Sean will know nothing. I want him, when he'll be able, I want that written in the book. When he'll grow up and be able to read the book, that he should know that he had a great-grandmother that loved him.
So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan, and she can pick up by talking about ethical wills.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so ethical wills. Thank you for coming to a presentation that has that term in it. Put ethical and will in the same phrase, and it probably makes you want to run out of the room, right? As Marjorie says, it's too bad that such a lovely thing actually has such a dreadful name. And I'm going to give you a sort of a history lesson about them in a few minutes so you'll understand what the derivation of the term is. I also want to thank you very much for including me and partnering me with David. David and I are colleagues, and what we do is very similar, as I think you'll understand. I take a sort of a slice of what he talked about and go into it in a little bit more depth. So I'll tell you all about ethical wills here this morning. I never heard myself of what an ethical will was until the year 2001. I was working as a freelance journalist, and I read a column in the Boston Globe, actually, that mentioned ethical wills, and I was really curious. I read enough about it, so it sort of piqued my curiosity. And I learned that they came out of the Jewish tradition, and so I went down to the to a temple library in Boston and researched and found out everything that I could about ethical wills. And what I learned was that they have their roots as I said, in the Jewish tradition, where about 800 years ago, it becomes clear that fathers were expected to write their sons a letter, sort of a treatise on what it means to live a worthy life, a good life, an ethical life. And that's the derivation of the term ethical will. And that it was intended that the sons, and I don't know where the daughters were or where the mothers were in this, but it was obviously intended, and it's oftentimes said in the letters, read this on the anniversary of my death, or read this once a year. So it was obvious that the sons were supposed to follow what the letter said, and then do the same thing for their sons. And many of those old ethical wills are very prescriptive. This is what I expect you to do. And that's not really the take on what a contemporary ethical will is. And in a few minutes, I'm going to read you an excerpt from one of those very oldest ethical wills. But very briefly, the short definition of an ethical will is that it's something that you create to be part of the record of your life, and that you create it with the intention that it is going to live beyond you and be accessible to folks after you are no longer here. And traditionally, they do take the form of letters. now people can make all kinds of video ethical wills, multimedia ethical wills, recorded ethical wills, so they don't necessarily have to be letters. But the idea is that you're creating something enduring, a message for your heirs that's going to be accessible after you are no longer here. That being said, I really encourage people to share their ethical wills while they're alive, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So as I said, about 800 years of history, ethical wills go back that far. However, the whole idea of transmitting important information from one generation to the next, that wasn't new 800 years ago. That's as old as the stories told around the campfire. Transmitting information that you think shouldn't be lost to history is really part of how we keep ourselves alive as a species. We've always done this. And what you see 800 years ago is the idea that survival of the next generation isn't just a matter of physical survival, but there's an element of the soul to that. The recipe for what it means to live a good life is much more than physical survival. There are elements of the soul, of traditions, of values that are also worth passing on, and that's what an ethical will touches on. So let's start with just a excerpt from one that is about 800 years old, written about 1190 by a man named Judah ibn Tibbon. He was living in southern Spain at the time, and he writes to his son about money. Let thy expenditure be well ordered. There's an olden proverb, go to bed without supper and rise without debt. For all the financial advisors in the room, I want you to make sure you tell that to your clients. Go to bed without supper and rise without debt. Defile not the honor of thy countenance by borrowing. May thy Creator save thee from that habit. So long before the days of credit cards, in 1190, this man is giving his son some good practical advice. And I love this Latin phrase, words fly away, but what's written remains. Isn't that true? We still hear Judah ibn Tibbon. He's saying to us, you know, I was here too. Don't let me disappear without a trace. Now, going forward in time, you see these documents written throughout the centuries. And I want to read you, here's another example. This is another Jewish gentleman who wrote about 100 years ago. And he writes, somewhere among these papers is a will made out by a lawyer. Its purpose is to dispose of any material things which I may possess at the time of my departure from this world to the unknown adventure beyond. I hope its terms will cause no ill among you. It seemed sensible when I made it, but it refers only to material things, which we enjoy only temporarily. I am much more concerned with having you inherit something that is vastly more important. Now, in the intervening years, between 1190 and now, people have been doing something like this, people of all different faiths, certainly all different genders, and not necessarily calling it anything, not necessarily calling it an ethical will. When I understood what an ethical will was, and when I read an example like that one that I just read you, the aha for me was, this fills in the missing piece of estate planning, which is exactly what Marjorie was talking about, where the legal documents answer the question of, what do I want my loved ones to have? The question of, what do I want my loved ones to know and to understand, that is, we leave that to chance and to conversations and communications that happen very naturally over the course of a lifetime. But the idea that you could consider what you would never want to go unsaid, and that you would want to make sure that your heirs, whoever your chosen audience, all is able to access, that idea, hooked to estate planning, which is where you're thinking about what you want to pass on with intention, that just made so much sense to me. I just thought, here's something very simple, very beautiful that anybody can do. Anybody can write a letter. And so that was the aha for me. And it's a place to consider that question of, well, what do I want to pass on besides money? What is my legacy going to be? And what do I want to make sure that I have communicated? So that's, even to understand what the idea of the ethical will forces you to ask yourself those questions. And so I think that is, so I think everyone ought to know what an ethical will is and decide whether or not, how it applies to them, and to answer the question for themselves to answer the question for themselves of, well, what is it that I want to make sure that I communicate? What do I want my heirs to really know and understand and give to them that isn't tangible? So this whole idea that you talked about, J. Hughes' definition of wealth, when you understand what an ethical will is and you think of this difference between tangible and intangible wealth, it changes your whole idea of what you have to give and what your wealth is. And I think that's another beautiful result of even knowing what an ethical will is and contemplating whether or not it's for you. So my insight is that this is something that everybody ought to consider, and as I said, I think is the missing piece of contemporary estate planning. So the question of, well, what do I want my loved ones to know and understand? That's a really big, that's a lot, isn't it? That's kind of a big question. And what I want to do is to have the chance for you to listen to several excerpts from some contemporary ethical wills where people have answered that question in different ways. And I wanted some volunteers actually to help me read these. I've got 5 little excerpts, just a couple of lines. So do I have a volunteer for number 1? Marjorie, would you like to do this one? This was written by a man who wanted to use his ethical will to pass on or to give some facts and explanations.
What I ultimately want to pass on to you is far greater than financial advantage, but a deep appreciation of the collective history and values you carry in your bones. This is your true wealth.
Thank you. So this gentleman was setting up a dynasty trust, and he hoped that the money that he was passing on to his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was going to last for a very long time. But he didn't want his heirs to get that money with no context. And he wanted them to know something about, well, who he was and where did the money come from and what were the values that built the wealth. And so he wrote this letter that that each of those heirs is going to get at the first distribution. And he told the story of his parents and his grandparents. He was half Chinese, half German, and he wanted them especially to understand the values that came from his grandparents and how that contributed to the success of his business and the money that they were going to enjoy. The second example, can I give this to you to read? Sure. Was written by a man who wanted to give his kids some advice.
It was from my 9th grade science teacher, Mr. Davidson, that I first learned the concept of ebbs and flows. He drew diagrams of cycles on the board, showing naturally occurring ups and downs. I see it in all areas of life, in biology, in business, in friendships, in marriages, and in society. Everything has its ebbs and flows, and sometimes when things are not quite like how I would like them to be, it is reassuring to remember this idea and not to jump in and try to force things to change.
Thank you. Wouldn't this be reassuring to get when you were in your early 20s? Now, this was a gentleman who created this ethical will when his kids were teenagers, and it was his intention to share it with them when they turned 21. He anticipated that he was going to be still alive when they received it, but he wanted to give them some kind of rules for the road. At a time when he thought it would be helpful for them. And he thought that it would be more effective if he wrote a letter to them that they could all read in the privacy of their own rooms, rather than sit them down across from the dining room table and say what would feel like sort of a lecture. Now, this man, I'm sure, he is very talkative and very open with his opinions. So he'd probably expressed this in some form earlier as they were growing up, but he had a chance to really set this down and to create a document that they could always access no matter what their age or circumstance. And I love this part of it because I think this is such a lovely message. Things aren't always going to be great. but hang on, because the flow will return. And I think that's just a lovely example of a father's love becoming very real and evident in something that his children can always access. The third example is an ethical will that was written not to children or to grandchildren, but to trustees. David, would you like to read this?
We do not want the funds to be so easily available that the beneficiaries feel they don't have to learn or don't have to work, and through no efforts of their own can enjoy a luxury lifestyle. It is not a question of us begrudging them the money, but our deep belief that they need to earn their lifestyle, because by doing so, they have the greatest opportunity for happiness.
So a trust document's another example of a legal document that doesn't have much personality in it. And when you consider the turnover of trustees, it becomes kind of a practical question of, well, will the trustees over time really understood what I wanted from the trust, or what we wanted from the trust? And so to create a non-binding letter, and I'm not sure that I've said this yet, very important, an ethical will is not binding. It's an advisory document. To write a non-binding advisory document for the trustees to have access to and enable the trustees to stand in your shoes is a very practical thing to do, and brings a lot of peace of mind to the grantor that maybe their wishes really will be understood from the inside, and that it gives the trustees something else to go on besides the bare bones of that document. So this couple wrote this. This is the key message that they wanted to let their trustees know. They didn't want the money to spoil the kids. However, there was one area that they wanted the trustees to be quite liberal about, and that was if one of their heirs wanted to start a business, it was okay for them to spend money even on that. And they gave some parameters about, the need for a business plan and so forth. But they said, even if you're not so sure you agree with this, it's okay with us if the money is spent on an entrepreneurial venture, because sometimes you lose money and that's okay. So they made that also very clear. At the same time as saying, in other areas we want you to be careful. So they made that distinction. Could you read this one?
Sure.
This is, go ahead, I'll explain it after you read this.
It would sadden me greatly if somehow you felt I was creating the trust because I value charity more than you. Please remember that love can't and shouldn't be measured by money or the size of your inheritance.
So this was written by a woman who set up a charitable remainder unit trust, and she wanted her kids to know why she had done this, and the actual trust was going to be going to the American Cancer Society because her mother had passed away from cancer, and she wanted to support cancer research. So she was giving a significant part of her estate to the trust. And so she wanted to make sure that her kids understood why she did this. And so this is a good example of what is sometimes known as an expression of donor intent, which is why you've set up things as you have in your estate when it comes to philanthropy. So, but a very personal message that's a pretty powerful message to the kids about her values about philanthropy, and as well as a chance for her to express some of her values about the meaning of money and the purpose of money. This last example, I'd like a woman to read this, and a mother. Got a volunteer? Yeah. Okay. Catch those boxes. Okay. And this last example was written by a mother who wanted to write an ethical will, not for any of these practical reasons that we've been talking about, but because she wanted to say thank you to her children and always have them have a message from her that was open and accessible, where they could hear her voice, quote unquote, again. And this is an excerpt of a one paragraph ethical will. This is just a piece of it.
I fully expect that I will live for a very long time, to see you well into adulthood and to share your future with you. There is much to look forward to, and I am planning on being a part of all the adventures and all the challenges and all the joys. But if for some reason I am not, the most important thing you need to know is how much My love for you created the person that you will remember as me. I made you quite literally in my womb, but you made me too. Thank you.
Thank you. So she wanted to say thank you, and she wanted to say I love you. And when it comes right down to it, this is what I think the heart of an ethical will is, that emotional piece. Because that's really what you want your audience, what your audience most wants to hear, if your audience is your children or your grandchildren. Now, children and grandchildren aren't the only audience for an ethical will, as I think I've explained. They can certainly be to trustees or successors. They can also be for children, people that have no children. They can go to spouses, parents, extended family, nieces and nephews. So there's no such thing as a standard ethical will, no such thing as a standard audience to an ethical will. But the idea is something, in all cases, it's a non-binding document that's usually directed to a particular audience as opposed to sort of an essay to the world. So I'm going to just run through basically the summary of what they are. As I think I've made it clear that it's essentially, it's a container for meaningful, enduring communication accessible after the death of its creator, and that's kind of a definition that I've come up with for that. And as I said, they're historically letters, but they can certainly be recordings or multimedia creations. I read somewhere the other day that someone had made an ethical will with a PowerPoint. You could do it. I don't think it's very personal, but that's what she had done. She thought that would be accessible, easily accessible to the next generations. One thing that I will always caution, that if people are creating something that is recorded, either on audio tape or videotape, that there be a transcript made as well, because you wouldn't want someone to put heart and soul into something. And then 50 years from now, if this is intended to be enduring, 50 years from now, someone take a look at that CD or that DVD and say, what the heck is this? And not have a machine to play it back on. So if you want to create something enduring, I'm hoping that paper will always be accessible for people, but have the transcript made so that that's there as well. And they can be written by individuals or couples. You heard an example, that letter of trustees was written by a couple. And if a couple is to do it, then they could create either something that was totally in common, or they could create something that was his voice, her voice, and their voice. Together, a variation on that kind of an arrangement. As I said, they're usually directed to a specific audience rather than being written sort of for the world at large. But some people write ethical wills and say, I'd like this to be read at my service. And so that's certainly a beautiful use of them as well. Ethical wills are not long, and this is the primary difference between a personal history and an ethical will. Ethical wills tend to be short and thematic. So they take a 30,000-foot view of life and they pluck out a few important points and themes, rather than a personal history, which tends to be chronological. So an ethical will is not chronological, it's thematic and tends not to be long. Non-binding, I said, very important to say, and if someone does choose to put in their ethical will some kind of an explanation perhaps about why they set up their estate plan the way that they did, or talk in any way at all about aspects of their estate plan, then it's a good idea to have a lawyer take a look at it, because you wouldn't want to have any language in the ethical will cloud or contradict the legal document, even though technically an ethical will is not a binding document. You would not want to make any lawyer nervous about that language. So have a lawyer check it if that's your subject matter at all. If you felt as though you had to be perfectly wise, know exactly what you were going to say, and it was going to be beautiful and perfect when you sat down to write it, and that was a condition for writing an ethical will, would you ever write it? And I think the answer is no, you probably wouldn't. Because I don't think that anybody feels as though, no matter how old they are, that they're quite ready to write their last words, which is essentially what an ethical will is. It serves as your last words. And so I really like to help people take the weight off of this. Think of it as a work in progress, because you are a work in progress and your audience is a work in progress. And what you might think that you would like is important for you to say now might change over time. And so you might want to modify it, add it, change it. Knowing that you might want to change it or alter it, for some people is reason enough to say, well, then I'm not going to do it now. I'll do it later when I know exactly what I'm going to say, and I may feel exactly and I feel I'm as wise as I'm going to be. And I don't care how old you are, I don't think you ever feel like you're quite as wise as you want to be. I mean, I think my father, who's 94, probably is still thinking to himself, maybe next year I'll finally get it together and understand who I am and ultimately what's important to me. And so I don't think anybody's really quite ready to do this. But that's not a reason not to do it. Because you don't really know what is going to happen tomorrow. And you don't want to ever risk being too late to do it. So what I urge people to do is to start with something really small. Like that one paragraph, that excerpt of that one paragraph ethical will, that was an exercise in writing something that was really short, less than a page. What would you say if you only had a page? And wasn't that a beautiful thing? Even if that was the only thing that she ever wrote, that's a beautiful thing. It does not have to be long or involved. Start with something small and put it down, knowing you can always add to it or change it later. Now, I'm sure you can imagine what an unethical ethical will is. That would be something that was not helpful. That would be something that was not positive. That would be something that was manipulative and used language to curse instead of to bless. So you need to be careful what you say in an ethical will. And if you want to control your heirs, talk to Marjorie. Don't do it passive-aggressively in an ethical will. These are intended to be helpful and positive and bring the readers back to your voice and back to you, to be intended to be comforting or helpful. So I want to emphasize again the value of thinking about these as being short. And thinking, when you try to think about what you might want to include in an ethical will, what is it that you would never want to go unsaid? That's a good starting point. What is it that you never want to go unsaid? And knowing that a lot of what you want to transmit, you're going to be transmitting very naturally in your conversations and in the way that you live, what your example is. But what would you want to put down and never want to go unsaid? The bottom line is that you create an ethical will in order to be influential, in order to create some kind of purposeful message that's going to be part of the record of your life and part of your legacy. But you don't really know the impact of something like this on your listeners or your readers. It's sort of a mystery about who would actually listen or read this in the future. You're creating kind of a message in a bottle that's going to go out, and you don't really know how it's going to be received, what people are going to take and do with your words, with what you've said. And the only hope that you really have is that you've put yourself out there, and people are going to take it in their own way. And that's okay, because your point is not to control them. Your point is to put yourself there for people to listen, accept, help as they choose to. And so it's true that you don't have any control really over how these are going to be taken in. But you know what you do have control over is your own experience in the process of creating it. And it's true that what you say to your audience, you have to say to yourself first. So the person who benefits first from creating an ethical will, and I think David would probably agree with me on this, that the value to you of sitting down and thinking about what do you want to know, never go unsaid, what are the messages you want to live beyond you, the power of thinking about that and actually putting pen to paper or putting voice to a recording is really powerful for you. What you say to them, you say to yourself first. It forces you to really sit down and say, well, what do I have to say? What do I want to say? And there's a tremendous peace of mind that comes when you put something down. So the person who receives the first gift is you, in terms of peace of mind and a little bit of your own wisdom. you will naturally learn about yourself and understand your own life path a little more fully and more deeply when you engage with the process. So it's a gift for you. It may be a gift for the recipients, but you don't know. But it's a gift to you. It's important when you do create a draft, no matter when you do it, is to make sure that you date it and sign it, and then make it accessible. So it would be terrible if you created something like this and no one ever found it. So print it out in its existing form and put it with your legal documents, or put a note with the legal documents that says this is where it can be found. Don't leave it buried in your computer. Now, my ethical will is actually a file. It's a digital file on my computer, but it's also a paper file. And the way that I have approached it is that it's a collection of writing. So it's not just one letter, but it's a number of letters, or it's a number of jottings or essays, or as I think about something that I might want to say, I write it down and I put it in the file. To me, that's an easier way to think of it than it having to be a singular document. So if that's helpful for people, take that as a model. Now, I urge you to have fun with this and to be creative about this. So someone said once to me, well, you know what I'm going to do with my ethical will is I'm going to make a list of my favorite movies and say, if you watch these movies, you'll understand me. And I thought that was really wonderful. Some people like to create lists with their ethical will, like 10 things I learned the hard way, or 5 bits of advice I want to give you. Some people are list makers, and that really works for them. Other people like to create kind of essays, like one-page sort of mini essays, reflections, a collection of reflections. So they can take any form. So I urge you not to feel, bound by any one particular form, because it's all a reflection of you and exactly who you are. So I know I told you earlier that I suggest that people share these as they're being created, and for some people that seems like not what they want to do. So some people say, I want to create this and I want this only to be read when I'm no longer here, to have this message from me that I know they're going to get when I'm no longer here. And that's totally valid. And I understand that. But I also say, consider the possibilities of taking what's essentially a monologue and creating a dialogue with it. And you heard a couple of examples here where people did that exactly with that intent, where it is sometimes easier to say things in writing that you really want everybody to know now. It's easier to start a conversation when everybody in your audience has the same information and they've read it first. So I urge you to consider that anyway, and it's okay to say to the audience, I'm continuing to work on this, but this is what I'm doing now, and I may add to it or change it, but I want you to see this. So it can be a great catalyst for conversation. So I urge you to keep that in mind. So I wanted to just mention that I have developed a couple tools, and one of them is this guidebook called The Wealth of Your Life, a step-by-step guide for creating your ethical will. And this is really just a brainstorming tool that enables you to really consider all the things you might want to say in an ethical will, but it's really written like a Chinese menu, so you would take a little bit from this section, a little bit from that section perhaps, and then go to your pad of paper or your computer or your recorder to then draft the document. So this is really just a place where you would take notes. But I have a couple of copies of this, and if you want to come up afterwards and take a look at it. The other thing that I developed are these cards, and you each have a set in front of you, which Javis Malm has given you as a complimentary gift for coming today. And these are cards. There's 12 of them, as you'll see when you go in your set. And these are prompts for either talking or writing. It's what we wanted to do here now for the last 10 minutes. It's just an opportunity for question and answer.
How much progress are you making with selling this idea? I mean, that seems like a great idea to me.
Yeah.
But penetrating the estate planning market
Right.
must be kind of a challenge. And one thought I had, I am not an estate planner, but I do
Right.
a lot of estate litigation. Something like this, or what David described, would be a wonderful way of ending a lot of will contests, for instance. And when you had ethical wills put up as the misnomer for what you do, I thought to myself, well, even more of a misnomer would be ethical will contest, because those are circumstances where family values completely break down.
Right.
And families end up, brothers and sisters end up not stop talking to each other for the rest of their lives. Grandchildren break up. They're horrible events. And so much could be done to prevent them if this kind of practice, what you and David described, were part of normal will planning. But most estate plans are made with 1 hour of time interacting with a lawyer. That is much more typical. And so I'm wondering, I mean, have you had any success in seeing these ideas adopted by what you might call the rank and file estate planners?
Well, it is, in my experience, has everything to do with the personality of the attorneys. So here's an example of an attorney who is very open to this. Not all attorneys are open to this, and not all their clients are open to this, because they're paying the attorneys by the hour. So they want to get the documents done and they want to go out the door.
Or sometimes, and excuse my interrupting,
Yeah.
I think the real problem is a lot of attorneys quote the estate planning on a fixed fee basis.
Right.
And then it's the attorney who wants to get in.
Right.
That's really the problem.
Yeah.
That I think is more of a problem. But just to second what you're saying.
But I'll say, where I see a real interest in this, in the estate planning world, are the financial advisors who are setting their clients up for the conversation with oftentimes setting their clients up for the review of the estate planning documents, or to go back and set one up with an estate planning attorney. I find a tremendous amount of receptivity with the financial advisors. Of course, they have a different kind of financial relationship with their clients. They're meeting with their clients more often, and they have reasons to really develop the relationship. But if you would like to serve on my marketing team and suggest that this be something that everybody does, then come on in.
Well,
I mean, I have had enormous success with my practice. I would say about 50% of my clients do ethical wills and side letters with fiduciaries, guardians, trustees. But one of the things is that I found in terms of efficiency, it actually oftentimes makes the estate planning practice more efficient, because clients get caught up in issues like, well, if we name this person as guardian, but then this other, person in the family might feel this and feel that. And I always say, you can just say it. I can't say it in a legal document, but you can explain it. Or a lot of times couples get stuck with who do they name as guardian, because nobody would see eye to eye to them. And when you open up the possibility of you can write a letter to future guardians and really outline your priorities as a parent, it actually keeps the process moving where it might otherwise get stalled out. That being said, I also do, and I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but I do have sample side letters and ethical wills that I give to clients that I just say, don't copy it, it's just so you can see some examples of how it's done. And that way, a lot of times what they produce looks nothing like that, but just the whole, oh, it's not that scary. And I would do it completely differently, wait, let me do it, and it keeps them going. But I always try to have them prepare it to be signed with the estate planning documents, so that it's all done at the same time.
Do you want to be on my marketing team?
I think I already am. I just, the amount of value that these add to clients and to the estate plan is just incredible.
Marcia, you wanted to say something too?
I actually have a question for David. Because I work with Tom a lot, and we have a family, for example, that we're trying to mediate into peace. And it's a really complicated family history, and there's a lot of really horrible feelings. And I'm wondering if there's if we end up being able to settle this, is there a value in memorializing that sort of journey?
Well, I mean, I'm working with a family now where they've had lots of conflict over many decades. But what is pulling them together is that their children and their grandchildren are asking them, this is a family business, we want to know the story of the founding of the business, even before all the conflict happened. So if they can go back to a period of harmony and hope and possibility that got them started, it can really be a great, the origin story is one that I always ask people, how did you get started? And that's always filled with great triumph and lots of challenges too, but it can bring them back to, yes, this was our anchor. This is the thing that got us all started. Maybe this will help us realize we got here with really good efforts and good intentions, and the other stuff maybe we can put that aside.
In common.
Yeah, it's their shared story is that success. So
would you do that from the perspective of several branches of the family?
there's no other way to do it. I think that one thing that when it comes up, and I'll facilitate writing someone's memoir, and then there's someone says, well, that's not the way it happened. I said, well, you write your own memoir. I mean, that's...
And then start the fight all over again.
No, well, actually, the great thing about memoir is that memoir is what you remember and how you remember to tell it. So by definition, it is subjective. I mean, to those of us who kind of really study history, realize that all history is subjective. That it's all from, there might be facts, but it's the facts that you choose to tell as opposed to the facts that you don't. You're telling those facts correctly, but you're leaving out a whole other part of the story. This is the challenge of underserved populations in the telling of American history, for example. So give them an opportunity to tell their own story. So because there are going to be those different perspectives, and they can sit simultaneously. It's okay. It doesn't have to be resolved. The ebb and flow. The conflict can sit without having to resolve it right now. The other thing too is that in working with estate planning attorneys or financial advisors or other professionals, is to plant the seed early. Is to bring up the idea to a client and say, have you ever considered documenting, recording your stories? Invariably, or often, the answer is no, because it's not the right time, or they just don't see themselves as doing that. But I find that over time, people, the idea has to be suggested to them, and that if you do it early, they're more likely to do it. Maybe not within a year, but soon.
And is there any, in terms of the following generations? You think about what the following generations need to know and understand about what happened? Is there any interest in them in terms of either healing or understanding the dynamics?
Aside from the hopelessness of the task, I'd say yes. But yeah.
No, it's
I mean, if you think about them.
Interesting concept. It's an interesting concept. And I mean, if it would be a very interesting application of what you do to use it as part of closing up a big, ambitious estate contest. It'd be a great way of closing it up.
That's true, because in our case, one of the parties said right from the beginning, I'm not going to agree to anything until I get to tell my story. Right. And nobody wanted to hear her story. No, that's true. So maybe
it's an interesting concept, very interesting concept. But you've never seen it applied, I guess.
No, not in that circumstance, no.
So Doug's had his hand up.
Oh, yes. A question for Susan. So, in this work, are you primarily an author and a resource for professionals, or are you a consultant in this work to families? And if so, how do you structure those engagements?
Well, the answer is all of the above. So I am a writer. I have a writing background, and I have ghostwritten many ethical wills in the same way that David does. So I sit down with someone and help them discern what the main messages are that they want to get across, and the process of actually thinking through that is a really valuable part of what I provide. And so I can certainly do a soup to nuts ghost written ethical will in consultation with the client. At the same time, I like to say to people, you don't need a professional writer to create an ethical will. I'm not here to say that that's essential. In fact, I don't think anybody can say it better than the author themselves. But I can help provide consulting services, anything from consulting. So people say, well, let's set up a schedule. I want to write this, but I want to work with you to be a coach. So kind of a coach consulting role all the way up to actually the ghostwriting of the documents. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, maybe you can give me an example of, for example, if we were going to call you into a case.
Right.
I'm thinking of one case. This is a family who lives in the present. There's an 80-year-old matriarch. There's a 60-year-old leader of the second generation business. This isn't on their radar. Mm-hmm. I'd like it to be. Mm-hmm. It's not my expertise, so I'd like to be able to do a handoff and say, I think you should talk to this person.
Right.
So what would you do? How would I prepare them?
Well, it'd be helpful if they came willingly.
Well, no, I don't think they'd object. I don't
Yeah.
think they're focused on it. I don't think they see it as important.
Right. Well, the first thing I would do then would be to sit down with them either as individually or as a pair, and make the case for what the value could be for them. Once I understand what their circumstances are, I have to make the case, first of all, for them to be able to buy in and say, yes, I'd really like to do this. If they don't buy in, then I can't. Then I'm not sure I could provide very much. But if I could get them to the point where they were willing to buy in or begin to buy in, then we'd sit down and have a series of taped conversations. And out of those conversations would come a frame for me to put something in writing or for them to respond to. So it's oftentimes helpful after the first conversation to be able to give them back the transcript and say, what do you think? What else do you want to add? What comes to you that you might also want to say? So time is really your ally here, my ally, in that the time of sitting and thinking and doing it over over several meetings is really helpful for them to be able to grasp what it is that they're trying to achieve.
Doug, are you asking, what do you say to the client to, tee it up for Susan to kind of convince them? Well,
Yeah.
the questions that you could ask are, have you ever considered documenting the history? We strongly believe that the history of a family business is an important asset, and that if you don't, do anything to preserve it, then it's going to be gone. So we think that idea of risk, it's putting this asset at risk by not doing anything. I think business owners can kind of wrap their heads around that concept, and that I often ask people, even individuals who are wavering about doing this idea of an ethical will or a personal history. I said, if you could bring back a family member who, you had questions for them and you wanted to answer those questions, what value would it be to you to bring them back? And so and they would say, oh, well, that would be awesome if I could, wonderful, I could bring back my grandparents and ask them these questions. Well, I said, well, you're now in that role. You have to see yourself as the keeper of the legacy, and what are you doing in order to preserve that legacy for your grandchildren so they aren't disconnected from this wealth that they might inherit or the business that they might inherit. So kind of getting them to think about that as an important tool for them is one step to help bring them along.
Another follow-up. Do you see their willingness? Well, it would seem to me that their willingness to engage in this kind of work, it depends on their sort of life stage. Mm-hmm. And you're certainly going to have much more success with folks in that 8th stage, the folks that are thinking about giving back, thinking about summing up their lives.
Right.
And I guess the challenge is, how do you get folks to see the value in this earlier on?
That's tricky. It's the reason why a lot of people don't craft a will until they get a terrible diagnosis.
Right.
It's that we just don't, as a culture, don't want to face the end. The thing that I've run into is that even if you bring it up, you'll address maybe 5 objections that most people bring up. One is, my story's not that important. There are other people whose stories are more important. Maybe not for a business owner, but a lot of women, unfortunately, think. I'm working with a client now. She says, well, my story's not important as my husband's. He started the business. I said, no, but your family history is really valuable. So the second is, my memory's not all that good. There's some things I've forgotten, but this memories beget memories idea that they come back. There's some things I don't want to remember. They're too painful. I don't even want to address them. So what they do is they throw out the whole thing just because they don't want to talk about this one aspect of their lives. And that's where memoir comes in. You don't have to talk about it. Let's not cover it. Eventually they do, but it doesn't have to be right out of the gate. And then the last one is, are you telling me that I've got one foot in the grave? And is this why you're asking me to do this? And so you say, well, everyone's going to go. And so if this is important to you, now while you're well, while your memory is clear, let's do it. And then in 5 or 10 years, just like the ongoing process of the ethical will, we'll come back and we'll record more stories.
The biggest pushback we get, and we've tried to bring you on many occasions, is they feel it's egotistical.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what it does is they are paying it forward and answering the questions that their immature grandchildren are going to have, and they are anticipating answering those questions, even though the children themselves, grandchildren, don't know that they have the questions, because they will eventually.
My question is a bit of a follow-up. When you're working with a family and you're suggesting these things, is your role really to come in both in terms of the film work and the writing, working to craft something that will be effective for a person who normally would not be able to say that for themselves? Is that the positioning? And or is it where your fee structure is, quite honestly, that if someone wants to involve in this type of emotional planning, which is important, they don't have to pay the legal fee consequences of having the lawyers interact with that kind of drafting? I'm just asking an open question that my clients may ask.
Well, certainly my fees are less than a lawyer's.
But it's a skill set the lawyer doesn't have anyway.
And maybe wouldn't necessarily naturally be seen as part of the process.
We're trained in such a way that we would be the worst at this because we would turn it into another trust document.
And it's a referral to a right.
Yeah.
It's a referral to another professional, as you would do with life insurance or another aspect of a person's estate plan that is not really core to what you do. That's how the work that I've gotten from attorneys and from financial advisors is. It's simply a referral. We think this is important. This person can help facilitate this process, either by coaching you through it or writing it entirely or recording it in any format that you like.
Well, I see the point very, very clearly as you raise issues with the individual who wants their story told but no one wants to listen to it. In family businesses, it's quite common that there's dissension. And when there's dissension, that individual may need help telling their story, may need that director to tell their life story and effectively communicate to the next generation what they want communicated, because it will appear bullheaded and forced if they simply turn a camera on and get in front of it and say, now I want to tell you people what I've always wanted to say.
The other thing is that some people say, well, everyone knows the story already.
Yes.
That's
right,
another
right.
objection.
That's the other one, right.
they already know the story, so why should I tell it? And when you bring in a third party that doesn't know the story and can ask those very objective questions, you get more information. So that's another advantage of bringing in somebody.
There's multi-generations now. I'm finding that third generations are, even if the second generation understands the legacy of the family, the third generation doesn't.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's it.
And the other aspect for the individual who might feel that they're being slighted or not heard in the family, I've seen this happen many, many times where when the person's telling their story and it reflects back to them either by hearing it themselves or by seeing it on paper, they get a distance from it. It's not all in their head. It's now being conveyed and recorded in some way that they get a chance to reflect on and say, they get a new insight into their own behavior, their own perspectives, because they've never had an opportunity to tell the story start to finish and get a new insight into what's going on. Or in addition, they also get to see it and get some perspective on and say, maybe this is not how I want to convey, who I am. I don't want to be the difficult one. I want some reconciliation now that I can see that it's in black and white. So that personal development happens in the process of telling the story all the time.
Right. So can I just ask one quick question? A lot of the pushback that you've gotten is saying, what are you saying? I have one foot in. Great. How would you approach a situation where a person who's been diagnosed with something and they may or may not recover? Mm-hmm. So now it's very sensitive, but perhaps all the more imperative. Mm-hmm.
It really depends on the person, because I've dealt with clients who they don't want to face. They're still not ready emotionally. They haven't faced their own mortality, but I just did a project for a couple where one had a terminal diagnosis and they were embracing the whole experience. One wanted to actually kind of just record the other one. And the other one said, no, I want you to record us together because it's our story together. So they were very at peace with the idea as best that they could at the time. So everyone in their own time, you can suggest it because you're opening their eyes to something that they might not have thought about before. They might have thought of doing it themselves, but they don't have the skill or they don't feel like they're.
Or they can't anymore.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And then you can facilitate that, and then it's up to them ultimately to decide yes or no, and there's nothing you can do about that.
I want to thank you again for coming. I want to thank Joanne Thoreau and Erin Gange. I'm going to say it wrong. Thank, of course, our panelists. And I was going to read this, but it's too late. But if you Google President Obama and ethical will, you will find his ethical will online. It's readily Googleable, and it's really very, very well written and beautiful, very moving. So I would encourage you to do that.